Hello my friend, and welcome to a video that feels long overdue. F-Log Beginner's Guide Update. I made this video several years ago about a beginner's guide to F-Log, just walking through all the things that I found helpful as I learned my way through F-Log. And then some of the particular things of F-Log 2 I haven't really updated and addressed in a video. And so that's what this is going to be. I'll try to keep it relatively quick if I can, because I actually still think that that video is helpful. So if you're looking for information about how to shoot log profiles using Fujifilm that are somewhat specific to Fujifilm, not just log in general, I would still recommend my video there, but this is going to be a little bit of an update with some new particular pieces. Before I dive in though, I want to acknowledge that Cine Dailies with my friend Evan Schneider made a good video, and Blaze Pivovar, a friend of mine, also made a good video about exposure guide and how they work with F-Log 2. So just want to acknowledge that right out of the gate. I think those are also some useful videos for you. But with that said, I'll go ahead and dive into the question of, do I still shoot F-Log at all? F-Log 1, I guess you could call it, versus F-Log 2. And do I still shoot cinematic chrome, which is my favorite classic chrome recipe that I use for video? So I think that's the first thing that I want to address. And I'll start the answer by acknowledging that it's an incredibly subjective topic, subjective even for me in the use cases of those different profiles for different situations. However, with that said, I will come right out and say I don't use F-Log anymore. If my camera is capable of F-Log 2, and at this moment, aside from the X-T3 that I still have around, all of my cameras are F-Log 2 capable, I don't use F-Log anymore. And there's reasons for that, and in short, it's because the color and the look of F-Log 2 is different enough, and the dynamic range benefits are extreme enough that I don't find a way of justifying F-Log in my workflow where I have a higher ISO than using my cinematic chrome, more workflow in terms of color grading post-production, and not enough of the benefits on the other side where I wouldn't just justify then using F-Log 2. So that might be an interesting way to start this video, and just saying that I actually don't use F-Log 1 anymore. I almost exclusively use F-Log 2 or cinematic chrome. And the cinematic chrome profile I still actually use probably 60 to 70% of the time. And that's based on personal preference. That's the part where it's totally subjective on the basis of, person to person. And I just don't find myself in that many jobs or scenarios or situations where I really need the additional benefits of a log profile. And so instead I end up opting for what I love, which are Fuji's colors straight out of the camera pretty much, with minor adjustments using my own personal LUTs usually in post-production. So I wanted to answer that right out of the gate because I don't use F-Log 1 really anymore. I use F-Log 2 almost exclusively if I'm in a log profile, but I'm actually still using cinematic chrome quite a bit, even with my XH2S. Now a couple of points, almost as if I was doing a review of F-Log 2. I want to say that the ISO 1250 right out of the gate is the first thing that we have to talk about. That's really high. And frankly, that comes with noise, right? In Fuji's world, it looks like grain, and we'll talk about that later. But ISO 1250 is pretty high. When other manufacturers are making their log profiles with a much lower base ISO, 1250 is almost unreasonable. So you have to be using ND. Yes, even me, who probably prefers to just ignore the ND, not talk about the 180 rule, and I would prefer to be able to just live with the shutter speed. Yes, and I know all of the wrong parts of that, but you just can't do that. You cannot do that at ISO 1250, so you have to be using some kind of ND. So a magnetic fixed ND has been my solution. Just in general, actually, these days, I've been toying with magnetic fixed ND instead of variable ND. The next issue is the pinks issue, which is sort of basically a magenta shift that seems to be happening in F-Log 2 that is unique, I think, versus F-Log and any of the film simulations. This channel pointed that out. I'll link it somewhere, but I thought it was maybe not real. I don't know. I had my questions, and then over time I actually started to feel it in my footage, and essentially it does appear that in F-Log 2, maybe uniquely, there is some sort of pink magenta shift, and I don't know if that's camera specific to the X-H2S. I don't know if that's been fixed by any future firmware updates, but I'm still on some of the original firmware of the X-H2S for a multitude of reasons, and I feel like it is a bit of an odd quirk that in color grading I feel a pinkish shift, and sometimes it is problematic for me to correct that, so something worth noting. But then the two other things are the 4K 60 limitation of F-Log 2 basically just reduces the amount of dynamic range, and again, I can't remember if that's specific to the X-H2S, but I do believe 4K 60 you reduce the amount of data in the dynamic range of F-Log 2. This was pointed out, I believe, by Gerald Undone. And you guys, if there is a theme to not only my YouTube channel, but to learning in general, it is find a multitude of sources. And so I would recommend learning from Gerald Undone about the technical components, where should you set your zebra levels for a true middle gray, and then referring to, like I said earlier, my friend Evan Schneider. He was on a Cine Dailies video, and then my friend Blaze. So anyway, this pinks issue was yet another YouTube channel that pointed this out, and at first, again, I had my questions, but I have found it to be the case. And then the 4K 60 thing was something I think I learned from Gerald Undone, that you need to be aware that just in certain situations with F-Log 2, you're going to have a limited amount of dynamic range. And lastly, Fuji's autofocus, which always has to come up in every conversation, but here it is again. The hybrid system that they use does rely at least partly on contrast, and I've never had Fuji confirm this for me, but I do feel it that when I'm in log recording modes, even when I'm using the on-screen F-Log assist, it still definitely has more trouble focusing than in a film simulation. So something to know. I have addressed that in my older F-Log guide, but I'll re-mention it in this video in the future about autofocus and its relationship to F-Log, but it's definitely sort of a negative component, I guess, here. And so yeah, if my review of F-Log started with those negatives, then I'll just dive into the positive components of it now too. By far the most important point to me, and this is why I continue to find myself using Fujifilm cameras in general, is that the colors are beautiful. There is something happening inside of F-Log 2 that is not happening in F-Log and not happening in their film simulations. I don't know what Fuji is doing. I know that it has something to do, of course, with the logarithmic curve, but it feels like there is something else going on there with respect to the color science and the way that it's interacting with the noise of the footage, like the grain of the footage, that creates such an attractive image that really feels organic. It feels just so beautiful to me in a way that I love shooting real film, and it's as close as I think I've experienced a digital sensor having an organic feel. And so hard to articulate, definitely difficult to explain, and yet I felt it right from the get-go with F-Log 2 versus F-Log versus the film simulations. And frankly, when I was shooting on F-Log, it never felt different to me than the film simulations. Just a bit more dynamic range and a bit more work to get that dynamic range. But F-Log 2, I am using probably about 30 to 40% of the time now, whereas with regular F-Log, I was probably only using 10% of the time when I was shooting. The reason for that is because F-Log 2 feels distinctively different in its image. And so I love the look that it gives me, and to be using it now about 40% of the time probably, I am using it because I cannot replicate that look. I have tried and I can't find a way to get the same sort of softness and texture and color in general out of my classic chrome, cinematic chrome footage, or even using other film simulations, and I have tried other film simulations. So that right out of the gate is by far the most important part about Fujifilm cameras to me in general, is the color and the image quality, and F-Log 2 might be the best that they've ever done. And when I say that, I'm only speaking really about the color, I suppose, in that whole little segment there, but then the dynamic range is felt. I did not feel it as much with F-Log on any of the cameras, and even here on my XH2S, I still don't really feel the big difference with F-Log compared to my cinematic chrome profile where I've just dialed back the Rec 709 simulation. But with F-Log 2, I can definitively and distinctively tell the difference when I bring that footage into DaVinci Resolve. I have drastic amounts of data there that I do not get when I'm in F-Log or when I'm in Classic Chrome. And I've demonstrated this in other videos before, but it continues to hold true that if I want more dynamic range and I'm in a tricky situation, then using F-Log 2 makes a world of difference, especially compared to even F-Log 1. Having said all that, now I'm just going to walk through my topics from the last video. You should go watch it. I do still think it's helpful, but I'm going to go one by one through these and just talk about if I'm changing my opinion on them since the F-Log 2 release or if they're still the same. So my file recommendations, I do think that on newer Fuji cameras, you should be using H.265. You should be at least in 200 megabits per second of data rate, because otherwise I just think you're making an unnecessary risk. You're not making your files small enough that you're going to be feeling a drastic difference, and you're also going to be risking a lot as you start dropping down the amount of data. And so I don't think you should be shooting H.264. I think 10-bit, the H.265 files are necessary. And I would also say that 200 megabits of data is very important, and I've demonstrated that in past videos, that 100 megabits of data just starts to get a little dangerous. And then, frankly, anywhere you want to go up from there, I think you'll be happy you did if you can afford the data. But otherwise, I would say once you get to their H.265 long GOP, 200 megabits per second in 4K, I don't think of any reasons to be shooting HD very often anymore. Then once you reach that ceiling, I think then at that point you're well enough on your way. And so that would be my file recommendation. Exposure tools, I would tell you that to this day I still am using basically my big three exposure tools in tandem. So I'm using my EV, I'm using the electronic metering, and I put it somewhere around 1 on F-Log 2. So one stop overexposed. Other people, like I've given you advice, go watch other people's videos. Other people might advise hotter, using +2 even. For me personally, I actually am okay with a little bit of grain in my shadows. I'm okay with a little bit of noise that Fuji looks like grain. I like the look of it. So I'm only ever shooting +1. And then as it starts to get darker, if I'm shooting natural light environments, I will lean even further down. I will go down into 0. I won't get down into -1 probably. That starts to get a little too heavy on the grain. But yeah, I'm using my EV. I'm using my histogram. Histogram is very important. And I'm using my zebras. And so I put my zebras somewhere around 90% these days. And then I use the 3 of them all together. And as I use the 3 of them all together, I have learned how to expose properly. And that gets at the point of practicing. But then low light, using F-Log 2 and low light, I'm probably going to say the same thing as F-Log and the same thing as Fuji's review in general. Fuji is not a low light king. It's not trying to be. APS sensors just are not trying to do the same thing as a full frame sensor. And even when it is, it's still got grain. It's still got noise on it. That said, of course, the grain is beautiful. I like it a lot. I would be careful though not to overdo it because you start to lose details. And so probably somewhere around 6,400 to 8,000 maybe is my cap, where it starts to cross into unusable. My preference would be to stay below 5,000. And then of course, I've made a video about this in the past, and this is worth noting, but somewhere I think around 2,500 or 3,200, I'm not remembering exactly at this moment, is where Fuji has their dual gain sensor. Basically, it's not actually that, but it turns on noise reduction internally, and you can't make it not do that. But it does help. So somewhere after 1250 and about 3,200, I actually just try to skip up to 3,200. I try not to shoot in between there too much. I almost try to treat it as if it was like a dual native sensor. And so low light, though, not its strong suit, Fuji in general, but it does work, and it works sufficiently well because the grain is not colored and it doesn't look distracting. White balance is incredibly important. Fuji is still very sensitive about its white balance, auto white balance, and so make sure you have it locked. I still love to use the auto white balance lock, so that I would say is a tool you should be using. And then if not, just have it locked into the appropriate preset, whether that's daylight, shade, tungsten, etc. Just have it locked, because a floating auto white balance on Fuji is a dangerous thing. And then monitoring. All Fuji cameras today come with monitoring in camera for the F-Log View Assist. It didn't used to be that way, and so that's exciting. So I would tell you, just use that. If you're monitoring using an external monitor, you can monitor a live LUT, and I know some people who do, whether that's a stylized LUT or whether that's a specific LUT they've made. Personally, I would probably just tell you to shoot using a standard conversion LUT, whether that's a custom LUT that you've made that is just a safe conversion, essentially an S-curve, or if you're using Fuji's LUT to do that, I would tell you just monitor in the safest way possible, capture the data in the camera, and just work afterwards to achieve the image you want. I would be careful about monitoring with LUTs that achieve a style or a look. So then the last thing is manual focus, is the note that I made in that video. And I will tell you here, because I already addressed it, that autofocus definitely takes a small hit when you're in log on Fuji. So you'll have to find a way to work around that, or if that does bother you too much, if you're using Fujifilm, autofocus shouldn't be a priority for you anyway. I've talked about that in other videos, but you should have yourself a system down to know when and when not to be using the autofocus, or the autofocus continuous versus the autofocus single mode. And yeah, that's just a matter of practice, strengths and weaknesses. If you need to be using manual focus, then do it. Just have it in your head all the time that F-Log 2 especially is not going to be most compatible with the highest quality autofocus out of a Fuji camera. So with all that out of the way, I would actually point you back to the last video and tell you to go watch the menu setup. Yes, of course, the details have changed. The details change per camera, but across the spectrum, actually setting up the menu is still just about the same, so I'm not going to redo that here. Go watch that video. I think you'll find it helpful for that. Also, in the last video, I went over exposure and focusing tips, and I think those are still beneficial too. So I would just point you back there to watch those. And in this video, we'll just dive into a bit of color grading, which is essentially just going to be me walking you through a few options that you have to work with F-Log 2 in post, particularly in DaVinci Resolve. So we're going to dive into DaVinci Resolve with F-Log 2 right now. All right, I could probably overwhelm you with examples right now. I'm going to try not to do it. I'm going to try to walk through just a few quick methods here in a couple of different lighting environments from real weddings that I've shot F-Log 2. And this is actually from the XS20 as well as the XH2S. And so I'm just going to dive right in here and say that the reason this video took me so long to make is because I wanted to wait until DaVinci Resolve released their official color space transform for F-Log 2. And here's why, is because this right here is the color space transform tool. So here's how you do that. If you're unfamiliar, you would go into your settings here and you would turn on the effects, color space transform, and then you would set it to Rec 2020, Fuji F-Log 2, and then set it to whatever your desired timeline is. Mine is Rec 709A. I will just tell you very briefly the reason for that. I'm going to open up my project settings and show you my color management is set to YRGB Rec 709A. Because if you have ever experienced the thing that happens where you export a video, it looks different on the internet, it looks different in QuickTime, it looks different in your Resolve, this is the surefire workaround that I've continued to find works for me. If I just work inside of a Rec 709 color space and I export it at a Rec 709 color space, nothing ever changes, never looks different. And frankly, I don't experience personally for my workflow the limitations of a confined color space. I'll leave it there. That's a different conversation. But this is what their conversion looks like. So this is the color space transform by DaVinci, which is an amazing tool, and it's just data. And so there's no style, there's no look. This is just what the Rec. 709 image looked like. And then this is Fuji's LUT. So this is the Fujifilm wide dynamic range XH2S F-Log 2 709 conversion. And you can tell right away the amount of midtone data that the color space transform tool kept. I do not personally like at all the way that the Fujifilm looks, because I think that they've lost so much of the midtone data. I could save that by pulling down my offset perhaps, and now they probably look very close, but something still just doesn't sit right with me about it, and I've never personally really loved Fujifilm's actual technical LUTs. And so anyway, and I waited to make this video because I don't just want you to pay for my LUTs. I don't just want this to be a sales pitch. There are lots of great LUTs out there. Other people make them too. But then as far as more technical conversions go, this is my conversion. And so you can tell it warms the footage up a little bit, but I really liked my technical conversion because it definitely makes it keeps the midtones better than Fuji's did. And this is before the color space transform tool came out. I made these LUTs for myself. And so now the color space transform tool looks impeccable, but at the time when that wasn't accessible, I wanted to keep more of the midtone data. So this is one of my F-Log conversion LUTs that I have available. And then if you want to skip altogether the conversion, you don't want to have a multi-layer node tree structure, I get it. It's intimidating. It can feel overwhelming, which is one of the many reasons I actually recommend for lots of people to just be shooting F-Log or just be shooting classic chrome instead of shooting F-Log. Shoot the cinematic chrome profile of mine. Don't shoot F-Log if you don't need to. But then if you want to skip that and you want to dive straight into a grade, this here is my Big Sur LUT with just straight application. If you wanted to tweak this, you could just a little bit, cool it down perhaps. Maybe it needs a little bit more pink in it. But that right there is a finished color grade probably for a lot of people. And you didn't have to go through a whole bunch of work. You shot this scene accurately. This scene is probably a full stop or maybe just a stop and a half, potentially like overexposed. This representation of the data here says that it's a bit maybe in the middle, but when I was shooting this, the EV said +1, maybe +1.3. So anyway, I want to show you that you don't always have to go through a multi-step grading process. I just want to make it feel a little less intimidating for you. And this final look here is from my P&W LUT pack, and there you go. I won't sell any more stuff. So anyway, let's take the color space transform tool, and I'm just going to command copy, and then I'm going to go to my next node here, and I'm going to paste it, or my next clip here. When I paste it here, you can see that this one was definitely slightly darker, and I shot this slightly darker. And so my EV on my screen actually said that I was underexposed by just a little bit. However, I was using my zebras in combination with my EV, and that's how I ended up knowing that this was the proper exposure to keep all the details in the highlights. Speaking of details in the highlights, I had to restart this clip. The clouds keep coming and going. So anyway, that's what is happening in this clip here, is that I shot this underexposed on purpose, and now when I convert it, you can see that I shot it properly. So when you look at this, look at where all that information is. It's very low on my waveform, especially when you compare it to this clip. If I reset the nodes here. So you can see that all that data here is being pushed usually up into this top side. And then here it's all down in this lower area. And that's because I wanted it to be there and very similar to this clip. So I'm showing you these as examples because it's really important to know that. you need to underexpose to protect your highlights still, even in a log profile. I would not recommend shooting way overexposed and thinking it's log and it will come back. And so now if I was going to correct this just a little bit, I would go and set a node right before, and here's how node trees start, is they start one step at a time. And I would maybe just bring up my gamma and see if that starts pulling up that forest. And if it doesn't, maybe I would pull up my lift just a little bit. And there you go. Almost all of that forest floor is now black, is back from the black point, but I want it to be a true black. So then towards the end of my node chain, what I would end up doing with my node tree is that I would end up pulling that lift back down, because after this node, I'm now working inside of a color space that is Rec 709. And I don't mean to confuse a beginner here, but basically you might find that you are having a hard time getting this to work the way you want it to. Your tools before the conversion will not work the same as your tools after the conversion. So just something to know and be aware of. And so this same color space transform tool applied to a completely different scene here, this is now what happens. And this must have been slightly off in the white balance, so you're going to have to make some adjustments here. And so we will add a node, and it clearly needs to be green and it needs to be cooler, but it was pink outside, and so we want to remember that with the sunset. We're okay with that, but that right there now looks much closer to an accurate skin tone and still retaining some of that pink glow of the sunset. And so anyway, then this situation here is another one where I want to point out my exposure. And so these three probably all just about the same, but I would say that in particular this one here, it had clearly started to get dark. Look, there's no more sunset happening. It's very blue in the background. And so I want to point out my exposure here to say I'm probably at maybe minus 0.5 here, minus 0.6. And you can tell that this grain is not distracting. I do not think this is distracting. I was still at the native ISO of 1250 here, but the grain is not yet distracting, and I think it looks really nice. And so I just want to point that out to say that the grain is not always a bad thing. The noise is not always a bad thing. Sometimes you can lean in and it looks really beautiful. And so anyway, that's a few different scenes and how to use a few different color grading tools. And that's all I have for this video. So like I said, go watch those other videos. Watch other people talk about F-Log 2, learn from them, find the method that works for you. Most of all, I just want you to know that it doesn't have to be intimidating, but if you feel intimidated by F-Log, don't feel any pressure to do it right away. Learn color grading, learn how to use your exposure tools, and do all of that inside of a Rec 709 environment that might provide you a bit more safety or ease right out of the gate, instead of jumping straight into log and feeling intimidated. So more than anything, that's the encouragement I want you to hear in this video, is that you don't have to use log to make great videos, but if you want to use log to make great videos, then it doesn't have to be scary. So thank you, friend, for watching this video. I hope you have a blessed day. Peace.